On Tuesday, Elijah called down fire from heaven and executed 450 false prophets. On Wednesday, he begged God to kill him. What happened in those 24 hours? For years, I thought Elijah just had weak faith. But then I stopped reading the story like a sermon illustration and started investigating it like a crime scene. I spent the last week investigating the evidence in 1 Kings verses 18 and 19. I mapped the timeline hour by hour. I calculated the physical distance Elijah traveled. I studied the physiology of adrenaline crashes and the neuroscience of trauma responses. And here's what I found. Elijah's collapse wasn't just a crisis of faith. It was a full biological crash. He had a biological crash, and God didn't rebuke him for it. God gave him a sandwich and a nap. If you've ever felt spiritually strong one day and completely broken the next, this investigation is for you, because what you're experiencing might not be sin. It might just be human. Let's establish the timeline. This is critical. 1 Kings 18. Elijah orchestrates the showdown on Mount Carmel. He's alone against 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. Think about the stress load of that moment. He's one man calling out an entire religious system backed by the king and queen. He builds an altar. He soaks it with water. He prays. Fire falls. The people fall on their faces. And then, verse 40, Elijah personally executes 450 prophets of Baal. This isn't a metaphor. This is hands-on, violent, physically exhausting work. From a physiological standpoint, Elijah's body would have been flooded with adrenaline for hours. Cortisol, norepinephrine. His heart rate would have been through the roof. His muscles primed for fight or flight. This is peak stress, peak spiritual warfare, peak physical exertion. But it doesn't stop there. Now look at what happens next in verses 41 to 46. After the confrontation, after the executions, Elijah climbs to the top of Mount Carmel. He prays for rain 7 times. Then rain comes. And then, verse 46, the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he ran before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. I looked this up. Mount Carmel to Jezreel is approximately 17 to 20 miles. Some scholars estimate longer depending on the route. Elijah ran that distance. After orchestrating a national confrontation. After executing 450 men. After praying through a 3-year drought. When I calculated this, I had to stop and process because we read this like it's a supernatural adrenaline. The hand of the Lord was on Elijah, but we assume that means his body didn't experience the physical toll. But that's not how the Spirit works. The Spirit empowers us through our humanity, not by bypassing it. Elijah's body just went through 20 plus miles of running after hours of high-stress confrontation. His glycogen stores are depleted. His muscles are shredded. His nervous system is fried. And here's what happens physiologically after an adrenaline dump. You crash. Hard. The cortisol drops. The serotonin plummets. The body demands rest. And if you don't get it, depression sets in. And this is where the timeline gets critical. Now we're in 1 Kings 19, less than 24 hours after Mount Carmel. Jezebel sends a death threat. By this time tomorrow, you're dead. And look at Elijah's response in verse 3. He was afraid, and he rose and ran for his life. Now here's what we miss. Elijah just watched God send fire from heaven. He just executed 450 false prophets with God's backing. He just outran a chariot supernaturally. Why is he suddenly afraid of one woman's threat? Because his body is in biological shutdown. His nervous system is depleted. His brain chemistry is bottomed out. This isn't a faith problem. This is a physiology problem. And his next move confirms it. Verses 3 and 4. Watch what Elijah does. He runs to Beersheba. That's another 100 plus miles south of Jezreel. Then he leaves his servant behind and goes another day's journey into the wilderness alone. And there, under a broom tree, he prays, "Take away my life. I am done. I'm no better than my fathers." I've been there. Maybe you have too. That moment after a spiritual high when you just want to quit, when everything feels meaningless. Here's the moment that changed everything for me. Verse 5 and 6. God sends an angel, and what does the angel bring? Not a sermon, not a rebuke, not a theology lesson on trust. Food and sleep. This is the smoking gun. God doesn't address Elijah's theology. He addresses his biology. Arise and eat. Eat the cake. Drink the water. Lie back down. Look at what God prioritizes here. Verses 7 and 8. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you." And he arose and ate and drank, and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. God feeds him twice, makes him rest, restores his physical strength before addressing anything spiritual, because God knows what we often forget. We are embodied souls. Our spiritual health and our physical health are not separate categories. This convicted me about how I treat burnout. When I crash spiritually after a season of intense spiritual battle, my first instinct is to assume I sinned, to search for what I did wrong, to repent of my weak faith. But sometimes the most spiritual thing I can do is eat a real meal, get 8 hours of sleep, and stop trying to power through on fumes. But there's one more piece to this investigation. After Elijah eats and sleeps and travels to Horeb, God finally speaks to him in verse 9. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" God doesn't scold. He asks a question. He invites Elijah to process. And Elijah unloads. In verse 10, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." He's discouraged. He feels alone. He thinks he's the only one left. And how does God respond? Not with thunder. Verses 11 to 13. God shows up in wind, earthquake, and fire, but he's not in those things. Then comes a low whisper. God speaks gently. He gives Elijah a new mission. He tells him he's not alone. There are 7,000 others who haven't bowed to Baal. But notice, all of this happens after God addresses Elijah's physical needs first. This is the wisdom of God. He doesn't spiritualize what is biological. He doesn't rebuke what is human. He meets Elijah in his exhaustion, feeds his body, restores his strength, and then redirects his perspective. Because God made us as integrated beings. Body and soul aren't enemies. They're partners. And when one crashes, the other suffers. So we've examined the evidence, the adrenaline dump from Mount Carmel, the 100-mile run, the physiological crash, the death wish under the broom tree. We've seen God's response. Food, water, sleep. Twice. If you want to walk through this material more slowly, I've put together a written case file on anxiety that lays out the passages, evidence, and questions in one place. You can find it linked in the description. But here's the insight that changed how I pastor my own soul. We've been taught that spiritual problems require spiritual solutions. But sometimes what feels like a spiritual crisis is actually a body crying out for care. He knows our frame. He remembers that we are dust. God doesn't expect us to operate like angels. He made us embodied, finite, dependent on sleep, food, rest, community. When Elijah broke down, God didn't say, "Have more faith." He said, "Eat this bread." Because God knows you can't think clearly when you're running on empty. You can't fight spiritual battles when your cortisol is bottomed out. You can't hear his voice when your nervous system is in survival mode. And this reveals the heart of the gospel. Jesus didn't come as a disembodied spirit. He came in the flesh. He got tired, so tired he slept through a storm. He got hungry, so hungry he cursed a fig tree. He experienced the full weight of human exhaustion and limitation. In Gethsemane, he asked his disciples to stay awake with him, but they couldn't, for their eyes were heavy. And Jesus didn't rebuke them for spiritual weakness. He acknowledged their humanity. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Jesus knows what it's like to be human, to be depleted, to need rest, and he offers us not condemnation for our frailty, but compassion. The same God who fed Elijah with angel bread is the same God who became flesh, experienced exhaustion, and invites us to come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. So now when I crash after a season of intense spiritual battle, and I still do, I don't immediately assume I've sinned. I ask myself, when did I last eat a real meal? When did I last sleep 8 hours? When did I last take a day off? And if the answer is, I can't remember, I know what God would say. Arise and eat. The journey is too great for you. Sometimes the most spiritual thing I can do is close my Bible, turn off the sermon, and take a nap. Look, I still fall into the trap of spiritualizing burnout. Have you experienced an Elijah moment? How did you navigate it? What did God teach you about body-soul connection? Drop a comment. I need to hear your investigations too. This was the third video in our series on anxiety. Make sure you catch the first 2 videos, and next week, we'll investigate the enemy's crime when he attacks us at 3 a.m. and causes insomnia.